So recently I read this article titled "Horror Films Deserve an Oscar Too," or deserve nominations too, something along those lines. I'll link it in the description down below if you guys would like to read it yourself. But basically what the article states is the article talks about how no horror film got any Oscar nomination this year. The Oscars are about a week away, and there wasn't a single horror flick that was nominated for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Makeup, or anything like that. And it basically goes in depth talking about how there are some horror films out there that are really good, that are better than a lot of the other movies that are nominated for these categories in these specific areas, and should definitely get attention for it, but they don't because horror is snubbed when it comes to awards shows. And I thought this might be an interesting subject to talk about. Now, firstly, let me say that I don't really like horror that much. I love film and books and movies when they're like suspense, when there's something that's super suspenseful or a thriller or something. But when it comes to horror, I don't really like it that much. And that sort of goes back to me being a bit of a sensitive idiot. Like, okay, so to put this in perspective, when I was in second grade, I remember very vividly, there was a moment when I was playing in recess and I saw some kid stomping on an anthill, and I cried my eyes out, ran to the teacher, and told on him because I was so sad that he was killing ants. So I'm very sensitive when it comes to death, or at least I used to be. I'm really sensitive when it comes to death and stuff like that in terms of everything, but I'm just more of a sensitive idiot. Okay, you can call me whatever you want in the comments section, but generally speaking, I don't really get as interested when the premise of a movie or a book, any kind of story, when the premise is, oh, look at all these people and women and children and animals being murdered in gruesome ways. That's obviously something that might not appeal to me quite as much as other stories do. However, I have recently been trying to get a little more interested in horror. I've played a number of video games that I don't know if you would categorize them as horror, but that one video game recently about the kids that go up to a log cabin in the mountains, and the one, I mean, a lot of classics like BioShock that are pretty scary games, right? Outlast. But for the most part, I haven't really watched that many horror films. Recently, I watched The Shining. This was like 6 months ago, but I apologize not seeing The Shining until I'm 22 years old. But I remember when I was watching The Shining, I was really blown away by how good it was, how beautiful it was with the cinematography. All the shots were absolutely incredible. The music, in particular, did a phenomenal job of making me feel emotion, making me feel suspense or fear or anger or whatever it is that the scene sort of depicted. The music just blew me away with how good it was at evoking emotion without doing jump scary stuff like the that orchestras do when they're trying to jump scare you, as if a mouse just ran underneath the orchestra. So I was really blown away by how good the music was, and I remember thinking while watching it about a third of the way through the film, wow, this music probably got nominated for an Oscar and probably won Best Original Screenplay or whatever the category is, or Best Original Soundtrack. That's what I'm trying to say. It was interesting to see that it hadn't, though. It hadn't won any awards, and that's what I thought about when I was reading this article. Horror definitely gets a bad rap when it comes to awards shows and how the public views it because it's a genre media. I think that's the thing that really drags it down quite a bit, is it's a genre the same way that comedy doesn't get nominated for a lot of things. Musicals don't typically get nominated for a lot of things, La La Land this year being the exception. And for the most part, you kind of think that's because genre media is bad. It relies on a lot of cliches, and it doesn't really make super good films. When you're looking at all comedy films, like you can see something like Annie Hall that's incredibly well done. That's obviously, you know, a romantic comedy. It has a lot of comedy in it, and it's a really funny movie. So you can see that winning Best Picture, and of course it did win the Best Picture. But you don't think, oh, Jack and Jill didn't get nominated for an Oscar because it's comedy. No, Jack and Jill didn't get nominated for an Oscar because it's a terrible movie. And for the most part, you might just look and say, well, comedies are probably pretty bad compared to dramas. And if we ever do have a good comedy, then it gets nominated anyway. But genre media does get a bad rap. And there are films like The Shining, or like a lot of the films listed in this article, that don't get nominated for things that they definitely could get nominated for. Not to put too much faith in the Oscars or any awards show. I mean, if you look at the Grammys, the Oscars, any of these awards shows, you can definitely see how they very quickly become a popularity contest, and the best thing doesn't always win what the category is about. Like, I remember seeing The Life of Pablo lose to, or not The Life of Pablo, To Pimp a Butterfly lose to whatever Taylor Swift album it was that beat out To Pimp a Butterfly. That just blew my mind, and that really opened up my eyes to how it's kind of just a popularity contest, at least at something like the Grammys. However, I think horror definitely deserves its share of the limelight, and I think this article has quite a bit of truth to it for a number of reasons. The first of which is that horror isn't actually about the horror in most of its films. I think a lot of the people that vote in stuff like Oscars, or a lot of the way that people look at horror films, is they look at them as these terrible, gruesome things the way that I used to look at them, thinking that, oh, it's a movie about people getting murdered. And there are films out there like Saw, like whatever, where it is just about the terrible murder of whatever, the gruesome, gory films that are just there to try and shock you and scare you. But for the most part, I actually don't think that's the defining element of horror. I think the defining element is an element of mystery. If you look at every horror film, every horror book or video game as well, it's all about mystery, right? Like, that mystery might be very simple. Who's killing someone? Oh, a psychopath is killing people, so he's just doing it because he's a psychopath. But I mean, if you look at BioShock, BioShock is a game that has a lot of elements underneath that initial jump-scary horror element. It has a lot of areas to discuss and a lot of interesting elements underneath it. And in film, something like The Shining. The Shining has a lot of supernatural elements. I don't know if that's the right word. The Shining has a lot of supernatural elements to it that are very interesting and sort of keeps you on the edge of your seat, figuring out everything that's happening. Why is everything happening? Learning all the nitty-gritty details of the scenery and how the lore of the world and the story and how things happen. I mean, sometimes, again, it is pretty simple, but sometimes it can get quite complex and interesting depending on how good the film typically is. And I think that's one of the reasons that horror is kind of snubbed, is because people don't think about it like that. But when horror is done right, then people don't think of it as horror, do they? They think of it as a mystery, or the term that people often use is psychological thriller. The big exception to the rule that this article has of horror films never getting nominated for Oscars is The Silence of the Lambs, which I have seen. The Silence of the Lambs is one of only 3 films to win the Big Five. The Big Five categories of Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, Best Picture, and Best Screenplay, I think. It won that along with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and some old-timey film, something about a night on the town, I think. Those are the only 3 films to ever win those 5 categories in a single Oscars. And it's definitely a phenomenal film that a lot of people hold in really high regard as one of the greatest films ever because of how well it's done, even though it's a horror film. But when you think of Silence of the Lambs, you don't think about the horror in it. You don't think about... Okay, I accidentally just spoiled the Silence of the Lambs while recording this, so I'm re-recording this quickly just in case you guys haven't seen it. But you don't think about the horror element of what's going on in the film when you watch it. You think about the dynamic of the main characters. You think about how they're interacting and how the filmmaking does a phenomenal job of... there are some great videos done by people like Every Frame of Painting that sort of goes into the meticulous details of how the direction of the film plays upon the characters characters' interactions with each other and the story as it progresses throughout the film. So I think there's definitely films out there that can be horror and can have terrible horror spooky elements in them, but they can be really good too. And when people look at them, they don't think of them as horror, they think of them as psychological thrillers. So if we were to take a second here and say, what should horror films do differently if they want to be taken more seriously and, you know, sort of play along with how this article, if this article, what it's stating really is a problem, how can we fix everything? Well, I think the way to fix it is by remarketing horror in a different way, where you're not just marketing it as people dying. You're not just marketing it. You know, if you want to make Saw, then you can go ahead and make Saw. You can make whatever you want to make, and you can market it however you want to market it, as whatever gruesome, you know, killing people in all sorts of phenomenal different ways. You can do whatever you want with your film, obviously. But if you want to sort of be taken a little more seriously when it comes to awards shows and how the public views your media, you should market it more as a psychological thriller. You should market it more as a story that has horrifying elements in it. You should market it more as a mystery that has horrifying elements in it. It can be the most terrible, horrifying thing, you know? Who's skinning people and cutting them up and eating them and doing this and that? You can do whatever you want, but market it as, like, the discovery of this story. And, I mean, look at Sherlock. There's definitely a market out there for mystery, and if you just focus on that mystery element of horror more so than the gruesome stuff, then maybe that's sort of the fix to get horror a little more respect when it comes to how the wider public audience views a genre media like it. But anyway, you guys can feel free to tell me what you think in the comments. I am not a horror connoisseur. I definitely enjoy a few of those kind of scary movies, but I just like the spooky thrillers, like I'm saying, The Shining or Silence of the Lambs or something like Secret Window. I can definitely appreciate it a lot, but I am not well versed. I have not seen a million different films. So if you have a strong opinion on this, you can feel free to correct me on how I'm wrong on everything in the comments down below. But anyway, I hope you guys all enjoyed watching today's video. I'll see you all tomorrow. Until then, thank you very much for watching. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day. I should probably stop saying good luck in solo queue.